All right, we are going to get this started. Thank you all for attending the 2020 Sunstone Digital Symposium, session 263, titled Mormons Like Me, Identity as Problem and Solution. The audio form of from this session will be available for purchase at sunstone.org after the symposium. The video recording of this session will be available in the Whova app for the remainder of 2020. For the Q&A, Jordan welcomes your questions throughout the panel, throughout his discussion, and I will be monitoring that in the Whova app and direct those as you put them in. At Sunstone, we are making it a goal to build a community that allows many ways for people to express their faith. Our tagline is, "There is more than one way to Mormon." We invite you to help us build a community where all paths are given space to be better understood. Please support us in our mission by making a donation and subscribing at sunstone.org. Now about this presentation. Who do we belong to? And how does identification motivate and shape our lives? Identification with our ego and our groups is inevitable and yet presents sticky problems. This session proposes that perpetual loss of identity is congruent with both spiritual and secular frameworks. A radical reading of Christ's identity points us toward identifying with context over content. Grief over loss of illusions of self and others are replaced with expanding gratitude. Now I'll take a second to introduce you to our speaker before we begin. Jordan K. Harmon is a clinical social worker who specializes in treating people who suffer with chronic suicidal ideation and self-harming behaviors. He is interested in the mechanisms of healing through interpersonal relationships and the implications for religious and political life. I will now give the floor over to Jordan.
Thanks, Daniel. Can you hear me? I'm trusting that you can. Daniel mentioned that the Q&A is kind of open throughout, and that's because I have this presentation is kind of a conglomeration of ideas, and I was over the last months kind of trying to write one through line, one essay, and it just wasn't coming because the ideas come from these kind of a circular path. And so I'm open to the discussion, and if people want to wait until the end of the remarks, that's fine too. I'll go ahead and share the slides or the PowerPoint now. So the title, Mormons Like Me, Identity as Problem and Solution. Some of you may have picked up on me trying to be clever with this title. If you've listened to Mormon stories in the past, or I'm talking about the podcast, of course, Mormon Stories. So when I was thinking about something to present at this symposium, I thought, well, this would be the place for this idea of talking about identity and talk about why it was that when I listened to the podcast, oftentimes back at 2010 or so, when I was listening, whenever I would hear the tagline, Mormons Like Me, I had this interesting kind of disruption feeling. I acknowledged the sense of the need for this kind of community to arise for people who needed to ask certain questions. But then there was this sense of this kind of resistance in me to have a new label, and to know what that label was, or to codify it. And so this, of course, this presentation isn't a critique of Mormon stories, or isn't even really about Mormon identity as much as it is about human identity and kind of human problems with identity making and meaning making. So let's see, go on to the next. There we go. Another title could very well have been something like this: False Gods, False Selves, False Others, the Blessing and Curse of Making Meaning. And I'll illustrate a story to go along with this. Just a few years ago, I was, maybe it was 3 years ago, I was at a retreat for therapists at the behavioral health agency I was working at. It was the new year, and we were doing exercise that was a kind of letting go exercise, kind of a grief exercise, and a new year kind of new resolution exercise that we were doing. And it had been a tough year at this behavioral health agency. I worked at for many years at New Roads Behavioral Health, a great place to work, and a place that people come to when they have severe addictions or severe mental health problems, like repeated suicide attempts and self-harm, and people finding themselves in institutions frequently for mental health and behavioral health issues. And so it was a tough year that year because we had lost some of our clients, some of our former clients and people, and there had been a lot of grief that we had experienced as therapists and as a community of colleagues and clients there. Our CEO, who's also an LCSW at the time, he was leading us in this grief exercise, and he wanted us to write a letter to something that we were grieving, a part of ourself, a relationship, a person. Write a letter to them, something that we're saying goodbye to. So, and especially something where there was some sort of pain involved with that goodbye. And I was kind of contemplating, who am I? Who is I couldn't really come up with anything initially. And then it came to me that there was this pain that I was experiencing, and it had to do with one of my children. And it had to do with on one level, it was the pain of seeing him struggle with things, with certain learning disabilities or differences, and certain struggles that were hard for him. And just the pain of seeing that, and the pain of not always knowing how to help, and sometimes knowing that some of the things I wanted to help him with I wouldn't be able to help him with. I would just need to, love him in the midst of it, right? But there was a deeper pain than that. It was the pain that I hadn't really seen. It was in my own kind of shadowy experience, and it was the pain of letting go of who I wanted him to be. It was the pain of letting go of a son I didn't have. So I wrote a letter to a son that I didn't have, to say goodbye to my ideal son. And as I wrote this letter, it was kind of silly. It's like, you don't exist, and and so this is interesting, and it was emotional as well. And then we wrote a letter back from this thing that we're saying goodbye to, and the son that I didn't have wrote me back and said, I'm writing to you, I don't exist, and your son does exist, and he needs you, and he loves you, and you love him. And it was a powerful experience. And what it's illustrating for me, or what I hope it's illustrating, is the way in which we don't know, the way in which our relationships are oftentimes with versions of people that aren't real. That we marry a spouse, let's say, or a partner, and we don't really we marry a version of them, and then we get to know them, and it's a struggle at times. We try to change people to be what we want them to be, or we idealize them and put them up on a pedestal, or the other. And this happens, I believe this happens with God, this happens with ourselves, and this happens with other people, that we cannot help but to make meaning in a way that's false. We grasp the truth of ideas, but also of people and entities, in a way that's always false, and stretching and yearning for the truth. So I'm going to talk more about this in some other contexts and some other angles that hopefully will fill this out. Little background for me. I graduated from BYU in 2002 in sociology. And one of the interesting things about that was when I came across theories of social construction, they were so profoundly resonating with me that it was like, this is long before I was hearing of people having faith crises, or long before podcasts and things. And I wasn't so much as having a faith crisis as having just a crisis of, wow, if this is all constructed, this makes sense, then what what can I trust? Just kind of an existential or epistemic crisis of how can you trust? Well, and yet you wake up and you keep living and you keep doing things like brushing your teeth and going to work and earning money because it's functional, because it works. But some of these ideas were so powerful to me, and they were exciting to me too. They weren't scary to me. They were scary in a kind of way, but not in a archetypal evil way, but more in an exciting to learn more. I did a master's in social work from 2007 to 2009, and I really dove into studying empathy and to studying Carl Rogers' humanistic approaches, and then practicing that in my internships, and finding that there's this, therapists and Carl Rogers and others have really done so much to understand and kind of crack a code of understanding to help people heal in profound ways that I think really mirror what we understand from studying the figure of Christ. That deep empathy, that meeting people where they're at, that letting go of giving advice or problem solving, and instead mourning with someone who mourns or being with them, is this powerful way that helps a person kind of free to grow in the way that they need to. So that was really powerful for me. And then later I studied mindfulness and contextual behavioral approaches. I was working with people where being there and being empathic was powerful. They knew that I cared about them, but the problems in their life were so extreme that I needed to understand other ways to help people who needed more than a validated environment. They needed out of hell. And they had extreme addictions or compulsive behaviors that made it so, yeah, they would come to therapy for an hour and be feeling valued, but that wasn't changing things outside of that setting. And it's hard for individual therapists to change the world, right? To meet the client. So we're trying to change and help clients cope with the world that's broken. Some of those therapies, dialectical behavior therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, some of these others definitely inform the way I think, obviously in my professional life as a therapist, but also the way I experience religion and my own relationship with God or with my higher power, the way my relationship with my family and with the ideas we're exploring today. This is one of my very favorite scriptures in the Book of Mormon, where the Spirit of the Lord is talking to Nephi and says unto him, "Knowest thou the condescension of God?" And Nephi says, "I said unto him, I know that he loveth his children, nevertheless I do not know the meaning of all things." It's pretty, cliche that love is the answer to every pop song and to every kind of, so many questions that it becomes almost a platitude or almost meaningless. But what I'm wanting to talk about here is somewhat about deconstruction, and that word gets thrown around a lot in terms of, or that concept of, we deconstruct when we're finding ourselves in a paradigm that isn't working, and then we reconstruct. And what I want to kind of argue is that deconstruction, like reconstruction, happens automatically in terms of us creating meaning. And we can, and we should, and we will deliberately reconstruct or construct, but we're always going to be constructing in ways that we have no awareness of. And that's not always harmful. It's just part of what we do. We are meaning-making machines. We're always connecting the dots. We're always relationally framing, as some behaviorists call it. So deconstruction is a work of love, if we come to it from a place of love, like Nephi here, this kind of epistemic humility of, I don't know. And then what remains, okay, love remains after we deconstruct. And part of the process of deconstructing is not fragilizing God or fragilizing love, and allowing deconstruction to go all the way so that what remains will express itself, will reveal itself. So this is a wagon wheel, as you can see. You know, I don't know what you call it, if it's called an integral thinker or a holistic thinker, but I can't, you could ask my wife, I can't talk about one idea without trying to tie every single other idea I've ever thought into it. And that can be pretty annoying for someone who's listening. But these are some of the ideas that that have informed, or some of the fields that have informed thinking about this and preparing for this discussion. So when we think about human identity, we can talk about biology, chemistry, physics. You know, we are living organisms. We're made up of oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen. We're inhabitants of the blue dot. There's these kind of factual things that we might consider hard science. We could think of it that way. There's also James Lovelock is a biologist who talks about the Gaia hypothesis, meaning that Earth is best understood as a self-organizing entity. So we're part of that entity. We can think about the theory of evolution, that we are Homo sapiens. We have evolved. We've unfolded as part of life. I finished recently the book Sapiens by Harari, and his discussion on what makes humans unique was very fascinating to me. His discussion about humans as creatures that can coordinate based on shared myths, unlike any other organism that's as far as we know existed on this earth. That the shared myths aren't just religious myths, but the shared myths are things like money or things like human rights. These are things that don't exist just in nature themselves. They exist out of human coordination and human idea abstraction. Like the idea of all men are created equal is a idea that I think most of us share and strive for and believe in as a truth. And Harari says it's a myth. That doesn't mean it's wrong. That doesn't mean it's bad. It just means that it's something that humans have constructed. And so it's an ideal maybe that we reach for, but it's not something that is naturally occurring. That actually human beings are not born equal, right? They are born very different, with very different capacities and abilities. Contextual behaviorism is a field in science that is basically helping us understand how to assess and predict and influence human behavior towards specific valued means, towards typically healing and well-being of humans. And there's theories and practices in there. So this is like the therapy realm. And they also discuss ways in which humans are unique, including one very geeky term, which is arbitrarily applicable relational responding, which in a nutshell means that humans have the capacity to learn in ways, and when I say learn, I mean like behavioral learning, like operant conditioning, classical conditioning, but we learn in ways that somersault our learning into imagination, into future and past, into creating civilization, creating technology, create kind of self-awareness, looking back at ourselves. And there's kind of a blessing and curse to that. We're the only species, at least this is what scientists tell us now, we're the only species that are capable of suicide and that do this. Systems thinking, you know, as a clinical social worker, as a LCSW, we train in systems thinking from the micro to the macro. And in the LDS world, we might call that spheres of influence. The LDS paradigm, LDS paradoxes specifically, and Buddhism has been, I'm not like a formally trained Buddhist, but I've gotten most of my contemplative practices from being a therapist and learning from that field and then training others in that field. Contemplative practices, myth symbols, kind of Jungian thinking, Freudian thinking. Another name for myths and symbols, we could say narratives and names that, again, as humans, it's something we can't even turn off, right? We are naming creatures, we're classifying creatures, we divide the world we name it, we conceptualize it, and then we connect dots into stories. And this is part of us. This is an integral part of who we are. And it creates amazing outcomes and very horrific outcomes for us. We have social constructions and deconstructions. And the way I like to think about that is a philosopher named Jack Caputo, who's kind of a Christian deconstructionist, describes deconstruction very simply. He says, anything that has to do with language at all is constructed. Just by nature, it's constructed. And anything that is constructed can be deconstructed. Deconstruction doesn't mean the thing that we're deconstructing is bad. It just means we can critically look at it, and we can kind of step back from it, and we can detach from it, and we can notice what is. Right? Dialectics, Hegelian dialectics, and I come again to that not from a philosophy, not as a philosopher, but as a therapist who practices dialectical behavior therapy. And dialectics is the merging of thesis, antithesis into synthesis. That's kind of a reductive way to think about it. A little bit more on dialectics, and we'll go there later, but in the therapy I practice, people who are struggling with chronic suicidality, emotional dysregulation, and self-harm behaviors and other struggles, it's perceived as they've experienced a series of dialectical failures in their life. So you can think of it as black and white thinking, but also in their relationships, people are either idealized completely or demonized. Their own sense of self, it's either nothing, there's absence, or it's like there's just too much, they're identifying with everything. With emotions, it's again, either shutting down and numb or just feeling every emotion. So we call these dialectical failures. There's kind of an all or nothing in each area. We can look at our political landscape and our kind of civil discourse landscape, and just in America especially, and it's hard not to see some of the very powerful kind of pathological ways that that if you were to diagnose the country, I think we would be diagnosed with having addictions and borderline personality disorder and all sorts of things. And so I'm really interested in trying to apply some of these kind of micro level ideas and interventions at the macro level. This today is a little more philosophical and theoretical. This is not the way I talk to clients in terms of presenting all this philosophy. Very influenced by Stoics and skeptics, and the idea of, Aristotle's or Socrates' statement, the only thing I know is I know nothing, and this kind of idea of epistemic humility. And then I think at a time where maybe I would have been having more of a faith crisis, I had somewhat of a epistemic crisis again in 2012 when I was in a PhD program. We were studying epistemology. And when you study epistemology, you find that top scientists are arguing about how we can come to know anything. And you have Popper, the falsificationist, you have Kuhn, who wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and they're kind of arguing about, is there a truth as a regulative ideal that's pulling us towards it, or no, are we just, as our scientists, just solving puzzles that appear in the paradigm, and there's no absolute truth to it. They're just, that's the paradigm, and eventually it'll crumble, and then there'll be a new one. And then Feyerabend, who was kind of a anarchist of science, saying, anything goes in epistemology, and let's elevate every way of knowing. And science will emerge, on its own. It doesn't need to be propped up. So anyway, this wagon wheel is like, okay, all these ideas are centering into what I want to talk about, right? That looks a little too clean. This is a little more like jambalaya. This is my jambalaya slide. So perhaps this discussion today feels a little more like jambalaya than this, in terms of the kind of a chunky mixture of things. And so I've had some pretty good jambalaya, so maybe this will be like that. Another version would be the donut, right? And I like this one because there's a hole in the middle. And with identity and with meaning, I think this is the key thing that we have to fight against as humans, is that we're always trying to complete. We're always trying to fill in and be finished with meaning, with identity. And I think that's what causes a lot of problems. It's turning ourselves into nouns, into objects, turning knowledge into something that you complete, turning a political movement into something that, you know, you're going to eventually be done with, or a religious kind of a relationship into something where you arrive, rather than there's something unknowable always at the center, I think is important. So to try to take a spoonful out of that jambalaya, we're going to follow a thread here. Homo sapiens have unfolded in the midst of carbon-based life on a planet orbiting a star. Consciousness has emerged in that life. Some people talk about it as the universe waking up to itself. Interestingly enough, in our stories of, in the Christian story of Adam and Eve, the first emotion experienced is shame, which is interesting to me. Shame is an emotion that as therapists, we are, you know, sometimes that's our number one enemy, is shame. How do we get someone to stop judging themselves for every thought, every action, stop feeling at their core like they are unacceptable? And part of it has, our profession as mental health therapists has been like, okay, how do we change people? So sometimes the people who are struggling the most with shame are the people who have had the most therapists, because they've been over and over again been going to change themselves and nothing's working. And the kind of internalized conditioned message is, there's something wrong with me, there's something wrong with me, I'm bad, I'm bad, I'm bad. So a lot of times, as therapists, we're helping people undo the harm from a paradigm, sometimes exacerbated by mental health paradigm of, you know, if you're sad, if you're anxious, then there's something wrong with you, rather than how do we help you change your relationship to your anxiety, to your sadness? How do we let you hold it differently? So something is different about human life than other life, and this can be found in many different disciplines. In the contextual behavioral sciences, we talk about humans being meaning-making machines, that we've learned through that arbitrarily applicable relational responding. We're generating relationships that are not necessarily direct relationships. Our minds are just doing that as we grow up. We gain that capacity and we can't really shut it off. And so we get stuck in these relational frames, and they can be comforting and they can help us and they can be functional. And then when there's pain attached, when there's tension attached, they get really sticky, and we tend to lose focus on the sense of freedom that we also sense that we have as humans, that's somewhat different than other forms of life. Agency, we might call it. So we're still animals, right? We still are driven by urges to fight and flee from pain and freeze from pain, whether it's real, so to speak, or imagined. We perceive ourselves and our group as rational, justified, whole, and right. We think of ourselves maybe as capable of reaching the promised land of satisfaction. And some psychoanalysts talk about the big other as this thing that's out there that we imagine will complete us. Kind of the idea that the grass is always greener, right? There's always a big other out there that we're kind of living for or striving towards. Group identity and ideology are two inevitable aspects of human activity that appear to be unavoidable. In the Book of Mormon, this comes across as the Nephites and the Lamanites and the Zoramites, and then gets resolved in this period of no matter of ites, right? No manner of ites in 4th Nephi, after Christ comes. Rivalrous dynamics are powerful incentivizing forces, right? Competition drives a lot of evolution, capitalism, kind of economic systems, and they drive our myths. When we watch movies, we don't want to watch a movie where there's no bad guy. no good guy. You know, it's like we're drawn to this conflict. It's the engine of our stories. And now that our species has developed what some people call exponential technology, this is a greater problem than it's been before, because ever since nuclear bombs were invented, we have the capacity to really wipe our species out. Interestingly enough, when we talk about existential threats and global climate crisis, we talk about it as humans are destroying the earth. And I think we're definitely destroying other species and ecosystems, but the earth is going to be pretty fine without us, right? Like whether we destroy ourselves in the short term or medium term, or whether it's thousands of years down the road, the earth will be fine without us until, of course, it's swallowed up by the sun. But there is this sense that like it's hard for us to identify outside, not just ourself or a group but outside of the species. So when we think about the climate crisis, we think of we're destroying the earth, but really it's we're destroying our species, or we're making it less likely that our species will be able to continue to exist, and thousands of other species as well. Detaching from or letting go of over-identification and ideology is an answer that is found in Eastern religions, in some interpretations of Christianity, and some versions of psychotherapy. The story of Christ's life, death, and resurrection points toward a compassionate deconstruction as a way forward for a species evolves for unrighteous dominion. So this is kind of a thread here, and that last part, the unrighteous dominion, I'm trying to bring in this idea that from the secular side of what's different about humans, I like the language of unrighteous dominion to say that's something that humans can do that no other creature can do. And you could think of it almost as an original sin, like it's something that we can't help but doing. And even in that same section, Joseph Smith discusses unrighteous dominion as something as when someone gets power, it inevitably goes here. And power is something that humans have, dominion, you might call it, over other creatures, and over when you have children, or if you're a boss at work, or if you're in a group that has been in power politically over another group. If you're right now, right, we're talking a lot about white privilege and male privilege and different types of privilege that it's almost like you can't even see the ways in which unrighteous dominion just kind of infects that kind of power. This is Peter Rollins. I purposely chose the most kind of emo, funny picture I could find of him. He's kind of a rock star philosopher guy from Ireland, from I think Belfast, and he's great. And anyway, consider this kind of a works cited page, right? He wrote this book, The Idolatry of God, which is excellent, and the next few slides will come from some of his ideas. And maybe he borrowed them from someone else, because he's kind of synthesizing a lot of other philosophers and psychoanalysts. So he talks about the Pauline cut, which is the Apostle Paul. Paul in Galatians talks about these different categories, these different types of identities, Jew and Gentile, slave and free, male and female. And these, Peter Rollins talks about these as natural cuts, meaning these are things we can see. These are identities that we can differentiate with our language and in our social, political, religious, biological structures. And this scripture from this comes from Galatians, where Paul says, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." So he's talking about how radical this teaching was from Paul in terms of identity, and the fact that what happens is Christ brings what he calls a horizontal cut, or the Pauline cut, which is this. So that Christ brings this sword of truth, and he separates mothers from children. He separates us from ourselves, the old creature to the new creature. And this kind of unifying, instead of unifying by these kind of different identity forms of identity, we're going to identify with being possessed by charity. We're going to identify by being this new creature. So there's problems with this that you could see, like, I'd say a similar problem with the all lives matter kind of idea. Like, hey, you know, you're focusing too much on race. Remember that as long as you're whatever it is, as long as you're the right church or you have the right belief, then don't focus on race. Don't focus on identity so much. And we could see that in other areas of what people sometimes call identity politics. And the problem with that, there's a few problems with that, but one of them is that we live in the world, you know, the direction to live in the world, but not of the world. We live in the world, and the world is historical, it is contextual, it does have power. And ignoring that is a mistake. Carl Jung talks about the two halves of life. The first half of life is where we structure our ego and our identity. We form a self. And then the second half of life is we're kind of losing that. We're finding meaning, and we lose ourself to connect with a bigger self, maybe a capital S self. So we can apply the Pauline cut to Mormonism. And I can't remember if this is the more than one way to Mormon or whatever. I think I heard that from at least one person. So I'm using that quote here. We have true believing Mormon, post-Mormon, all these different types of Mormons. And rather than kind of identifying, you know, by these kinds of vertical cuts, it doesn't mean getting rid of them. We still have them. And allowing for the natural cut, or not the natural cut, allowing for the Pauline cut, or the cut of Christ's sword to create in us the old creature and the new creature. And, you know, this is kind of, is this a one-time thing, or is this an ongoing process? The Mormon version is this is an ongoing process. I think that's the Paul version too. It's not that there's one day that I was cut through and I was born again. It's that this is an I die daily thing. And how do I, whatever I am, and I am in the world, and so I am going to use names, and I am going to use labels, and I'm going to make statements and use choices and use my privilege or political power in ways that I feel are right. And how do I let myself still be cut into this new creature? So want to discuss a little bit about self as context versus content. This is an idea from contextual behavioral science and from specifically acceptance and commitment therapy. This is a metaphor to use to help us relate to ourselves in different ways. Stephen Hayes is the therapist and researcher who is one of the main people who developed these ideas and in this way. And at a training I was at, he said one time, all psychopathology, all mental illness, but psychopathology is rooted in selfishness. It was somewhat of a controversial statement. He didn't mean selfishness like people who are mentally ill are just being selfish in a pejorative term. He meant it selfishness in the sense of we're identifying ourselves as content. We're identifying ourselves as I am this, I am that, I am this static, I am this noun, which for people who are narcissistic, it becomes I am great, I am the best at this, I am the greatest at this, I am the greatest as this. That's self as content. Whereas if what's coming into our content, if our thoughts are negative about ourselves, about our body image, about our emotions, about our achievements, then it's like, you know, we're just awful. And so the water here, you know, there's H2O in both of these pictures, but one of them is part of this living system. There's clouds in the sky that are carrying water and that are evaporating. You know, the sky is and the sun is drawing water up from the lake, and then it'll rain and snow in this. This is Silver Lake here. I borrowed this picture from Mark Burns. I don't know if you're there, Mark, but there's this ongoing process, and so we call it self as context or self as process. Whereas self as content is like, I am Jordan, I am a therapist, I am Mormon, or I am non-Mormon, or whatever these statements. And what happens is when those things are threatened, if that's who we are, then we don't know who we are, right? And there's nothing. So the idea is we want to identify with this ongoing context of life, that we're more than any one name, any one story, any one thing. So I'm going to skip through this. So I'm going to skip through this part as well, because I know I can get going. So spheres of influence and systems thinking. When therapists meet with a new client, we do what's called a biopsychosocial assessment, or sometimes people do biopsychosocial spiritual assessment. And we want to understand that person at different levels. We're complex. We have a lot going on in our life, a lot of learned history, a lot of different parts of ourselves. And we exist in a complex system, an ecosystem of identities. We have the self, me, myself, we have our family, our identity, my cultural identity, my species. And then there is the kind of the other, right? The other person, the other family, or the people who aren't in my family, the other culture. And then we have non-humans, right, outside of us. And I want to apply this kind of systems thinking in the Pauline cut here to like, one idea is, how do we identify as more than, kind of building on the common, what's common about us. And one way that people try to do this, right, is, okay, we all have the same God. We're all children of God. And that works many times. That can be a way for people to unite together. The problem with that is, of course, oftentimes the beliefs about God are that God has favorite children. And so if someone's hurting or bad, then it's like, well, they must have done something bad, and whether in this life or the pre-earth life, if someone's hurting or something's unfair, well, you must have earned it, because we're a literal child of God, so they must have done something. So uniting as children of God can help, but it's also probably, caused the Crusades, because it's like, okay, we're children of God. Those people are enemies because they're not children of God, or they're not the children who are favored, right? And so it causes problems there. Now, bringing that to a more kind of functional or secular saying, we might say life, that God another metaphor for God, because it could be life unfolding. And inside the identity of me, we have all, each of us have our own biological, psychological, social, spiritual domains. Inside of my family, close friends, there's others in that. There's others. There's my siblings. There's my friends. There's my children. There's my spouse. Inside the cultural group, there's different families. There's different friends. Inside the human species, there's all these different groups and cultural groups. And so then we have non-human life over here, which are also part of living systems. Everything on the earth, right? Going back to Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis. So, maybe the answer is if we can just identify as life itself, life unfolding. We're all part of human existence. The thing that happens, when you're doing a lot of meditation and contemplative practices, or those who have done a lot of spiritual work with other kind of altered states, is you eventually confront something even bigger than life unfolding, right? What's bigger than life unfolding? What's bigger than life itself? And what we come to, right, is some sort of void. That death, or whether it's death of an individual, death of a loved one, death of the human species, death of the universe, there's this kind of, when we really deconstruct and allow ourselves to sit with what is, what comes up is the reality of impermanence, and the reality of entropy and all things fading away. And it's heavy, right? There's a kind of turning away from this kind of black hole energy. And you know, we want to cling to meaning, and we want to cling to life, and we want to cling to versions of ourselves and each other that, even if they're not fully true, we want to cling to it because there's safety in it. And there's this fear of, if I let go, if I let myself question even love or whatever, what if there's nothing? What if it's just meaninglessness? What if it's just void? And what I've found is that out of that, and I've experienced this with others, that life continues to unfold. So that construction, reconstruction, whatever we call it, life happens. Life finds a way, right? As Jeff Goldblum's character says in Jurassic Park. And so what I'm arguing is that deconstruction, faithful deconstruction, is about getting closer and closer and closer to reality as it is, life as it is. And this is something that the mystics talk about. This is something that contemplative practitioners talk about. And it doesn't mean that we still don't live in the world and we still don't do political work or help people through their problems. But it means that that we can let go of trying to be finished. We can let go of trying to finish each other in our minds and finish our ideas. So I was going to go on to dialectical approaches. One interesting thing just to note here is, as you see, many of you might be familiar with the kind of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. As you see the crossover between ideas in this Venn diagram, the truth, right, the new truth that's more true than the two other parts is smaller than the two previous parts. And if you keep doing that, it gets smaller and smaller in terms of, like, so here we have thesis, antithesis, and then the synthesis is the new kind of color. But as you keep doing this and you add more paradigms of truth, you get a smaller and smaller cross section. And so this is the idea that deconstruction and dialectics, that a dialectical approach is a kind of deconstruction approach. It feels kind of additive and construction because you're adding ideas together, but you're taking the truth out of both sides and you're holding both, right? Proving contraries, you're holding that kind of dialectical tension. Here's some of the enduring dialectics: acceptance and change, being and doing, grace and work, mercy and justice. There's many. We don't have a ton of time left. Let's see, we only have 12 minutes. So I'm gonna go ahead and, let's see, how do I wanna wrap up here? This is, some of you know about the is-ought problem that David Hume talked about. The actual key dialectic in therapy, and I would argue in religion, is acceptance and change. And that they both hold truth, but it's hard to hold them together. A lot of times we're either over here on the acceptance side and we feel stuck. It's not so much of an acceptance as a nothing will get better. And then there's the change side, which is like, you have to improve, you have to be better, you should be better, you should be better. So acceptance and change parallels with Hume's guillotine, it's called, is the is-ought problem. And ought is another word for should. And my daughter Louisa teases me because should is like the worst curse word in our family. Like, she never, if I say should or if someone says should, she's learned from me, because that's something as a DBT practitioner, I'm training my clients out of saying should or shouldn't, because it's this kind of judgmental statement that leaves them usually shaming themselves more. So that action isn't done out of the possibility of and the freedom to act, but it's done out of this kind of weight of, I'm not good enough, I need to be better, or they're not good enough, they need to be better. So one way of thinking of kind of solving this is ought problem is to move the ought over to the is, because again, humans, this is what we do. This is part of reality. We moralize, we form meaning structures, we compare better, you know, we do all this kind of stuff. So this is what is, this is reality. It's human reality. It doesn't happen in the natural world as before humans existed. But what we can replace should with is could, like what could be, what's the potential. So when we're trying to change, when we're trying to do something different or help someone else, it's rather than we should do this or we shouldn't do this, it's we could do this. So how this ties back in with identity, we'll have to see. I mean, this is kind of part of the jambalaya, I guess. I'm not going to do the parable about the Tower of Babel. That'll come another time. But I will end up with, back to this, love is the ultimate decentering practice for those who are comfortable. And it's the ultimate centering practice for those who are, that should say, love is the ultimate decentering practice for those who are comfortable and the ultimate centering practice for those who are uncomfortable. Sorry, that's a misspelling there. And love at all levels. The most radical teaching to me of Christ is loving your enemies. That doesn't mean enabling oppression, but it means allowing ourselves the discomfort of humanizing the demon that we see before us that is harmful. And humanizing them doesn't mean allowing, it doesn't mean contributing to oppression. But there is an allowance. There is a long suffering in charity that allows for the pain in the present moment so that what can be different, so what we can do with our freedom, with our actions, with our choices can become more clear. So if we can then open up to questions here, I would be glad to, or discussion.
All right. So one question that I have, you've given us lots to think about, and I'm guessing some more questions are going to come in as we talk a bit here. How does the eternal perspective, as taught in Mormonism, shift the identity structure for Mormons compared to other Christians or even non-religious people?
Okay, can you read it one more time?
How does the eternal perspective, as taught in Mormonism, shift the identity structure for Mormons compared to other Christians or even non-religious people?
Oh, okay. So I like that question. I want to spend a little more time thinking about it. But in eternal perspective, I like kind of where Dieter Uchtdorf took it when he said we're always in the middle. I think sometimes we think eternal perspective, and then we think like, one day I'll be in eternity. I'll be in eternal life one day. Whereas Dieter Uchtdorf is the only apostle I've ever heard talk about it as we are in eternity right now. And there's a lot of parallels with Eastern beliefs in terms of our spirits being co-eternal with God, not having been created by God. One of my favorite books that I think talks to this isn't from a Mormon, but he kind of brought Eastern ideas to Western audiences. Alan Watts' book is The Wisdom of Insecurity, and he talks about how there is no future, there is no past, there is only now, eternally now. And for those of you, if any of you have gotten into contemplative practices, mindfulness and meditation, you get kind of converted to just that reality. It's not even really a belief. It's just a common sense thing that the future exists only as an idea, but every single time I've ever been in the future, it was always, it became now when I was there. The past is an idea. When I was in it, it was now. So we're already in eternity. I think there's a lot, to me, the Mormon idea of the gospel continuing to unfold, or the restoration is ongoing, is super important. And part of that ongoing is we're going to be hopefully learning and adopting many, many more of these Eastern ideas that are true into the, and it's already happening. I mean, I think Adam Miller is one of the best or the most important kind of Mormon philosophers doing some of that stuff. I don't know if I went where the person was hoping me to go with this, but part of that is we are unfinished. If we're eternal, then there's no end point, right? And that can cause a little bit of like, then what do I do? And we can bring it back to right now and say, okay, I'm alive right now. You know, instead of future tripping, instead of getting caught up in the constructions of our mind.
Fascinating. Thank you for that. One last question that we have here is in connection with Hume's guillotine of moving the ought over with the is. In Mormonism, love is taught, but so is judgment.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems judgment would fall in the could category.
Yeah.
How does that intersect?
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, so I think one of the most important practices to develop to me in the last 10 years and before, but it's become more and more important, is the practice of what we call a non-judgmental stance. So judgment is something that we do as humans. It happens, right? We compare and we do this, but righteous judgment and unrighteous judgment, I think there's an important distinction. And it seems to me that righteous judgment would be God's judgment. And so God's judgment, it's kind of like with that judgment that you judge, you will be judged. My God is very merciful. And so my God is a very non-judgmental judge. So it doesn't mean he's non-judgmental, but he's judging righteously, accurately. You know, again, as a therapist and a behaviorist, one of the axioms we have in behavior is that all behavior is caused. And what it allows us to do is to see that every single thing that a person does doesn't mean we have to like it or agree with it, but everything that a person does, there's a way in which it makes sense. There's a way in which there's a particle of validity to it. Even your most ardent enemy, you know, we could sit down and, there's the saying, it's impossible to hate someone when you know their story. I believe it. You know, I've had clients who have done awful things to people. And I've had clients that I don't like very much, but I've loved every single one of them. And because when you hear their story, when you still are discerning, maybe that's another word, some of this might be semantics, but judging righteously is judging accurately, and you cannot judge accurately unless you have complete contextual awareness, which no human being has. And so only a perfect God would have that, right? And that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to understand better and get better contextual awareness, but to do that, we have to listen. We have to ask better questions, not why did you do that questions, but what are you going through right now? What is this like for you right now? And leave open. Judgment kind of closes the circle of meaning, right? It's like, okay, now I know, and I can be sure. It feels good, it feels strong, it feels comfortable, and it's a form of unrighteous dominion. And we do it to ourselves as much as we do it to anyone else.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. We thank you for your wonderful presentation and your answers to the questions. We are at the end of our time, so thank you for that. And thank you for everyone who has attended, and we hope that you continue to enjoy the rest of the symposium. And thank you for supporting Sunstone.
Thank you.